April 1945. A locked boxcar on a forgotten railway track outside Frankfurt. 89 German women sat in complete darkness. No food, no water, no light. Just the smell of death and the sound of their own breathing growing weaker. Their officers had told them one thing before sealing the doors. If the Americans find you, they will shoot you. No mercy. No exception. 12 days passed. 3 women died. The rest waited for death. Then the Americans found them. But what happened next was not execution. It was not punishment. It was not revenge. What happened next would shatter everything these women believed about their enemy, and it would break them in ways that cruelty never could. This is the story they never told you in history class. And by the end, you will understand why kindness can be more powerful than any weapon ever made. If you love stories like this, stories that history tried to forget, hit that subscribe button right now. Like this video, and stay until the end. Because what these women discovered about their American captors will change how you see humanity forever. Let me show you what really happened. April 17th, 1945. A railway platform somewhere in central Germany. The exact location lost in the chaos of the Reich's final collapse. 89 women stood in formation, wearing the gray-green uniforms of Wehrmacht auxiliaries. They carried small bags with whatever they had managed to pack. A change of clothes, a photograph, a comb. The officer in charge, a thin man with hollow eyes, told them they were being evacuated east, away from the advancing American army. But then he said something else, something that turned their blood cold. "If the Americans catch you," he said, his voice flat, "they will shoot you on sight. They take no prisoners, especially not women who served the Reich." No one questioned him. No one dared. This was April 1945. The war was lost, and everyone knew it. Discipline had collapsed. Officers disappeared in the night. Orders contradicted each other daily. But fear still ruled, and the fear of the Americans had been drilled into them for years. They were loaded into a freight boxcar, not a passenger train, a boxcar designed for grain or machinery. The floor was bare wood. The walls were rust-stained metal. There were no seats, no windows except 2 small vents near the ceiling, and no toilets. Hannelore Voss, a 24-year-old radio operator from Hamburg, counted the women as they climbed inside. 89 bodies pressed into a space meant for cargo, not people. The air was already thick before the doors even closed. "How long will the journey be?" someone asked the officer. 2 days, he answered. Maybe 3. Then the iron doors slammed shut. The heavy chains rattled into place. The lock clicked, and the world became darkness. The train lurched forward with a screech of metal on metal. The women stumbled, grabbing onto each other for balance. The boxcar smelled of rust and old grain and fear. Dorle Pfeiffer, the youngest at 20 years old, sat pressed against the wall near the door. She clutched a small bag that held a photograph of her parents and a letter from her younger brother serving on the Eastern Front. She had been a telephone operator in Munich, connecting calls, filing papers, doing what she was told. Now she was here, locked in darkness, being told the enemy would execute her if they found her. Waltraud Ebner, a 28-year-old nurse everyone called Trudy, tried to establish some order. She had medical training. She understood what would happen if they panicked. "We need to ration our space," she said firmly. "Half of us sit, half stand. We switch every 2 hours." It worked for the first day, but there was no food, no water. The officer had promised they would receive supplies at the first stop. The train never stopped. It rolled forward through the night, then slowed, then sat idle on a siding for hours, then moved again. No one came. No one opened the doors. By the second day, thirst became the enemy. Mouths went dry. Lips cracked. One woman had brought a small canteen. She shared it, 1 capful at a time, among 89 women. It was gone by noon. By the third day, hunger joined thirst. Stomachs cramped. Heads ached. The smell inside the boxcar changed. There was no toilet, only a corner they designated for human waste. The stench grew unbearable. Hannelore kept a diary. Even in the darkness, she wrote by touch, her pencil scratching across the paper she could not see. "Day 3, she wrote. "No water. Tongue feels like leather. Dorle fainted this morning. We revived her, but she is weak. The train has not moved in 6 hours. I think they have forgotten us." They had not been forgotten. They had been abandoned. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating. Officers deserted. Supply chains vanished. Nobody knew who was responsible for the train or where it was supposed to go. In the chaos of a collapsing empire, 89 women in a locked boxcar simply ceased to matter. By day 5, the first woman died. Her name was Elfriede Hagedorn, a signals auxiliary from Leipzig. She had stopped speaking on day 4, stopped moving on day 5. When they checked her pulse, there was nothing. They laid her body in the corner, as far from the living as the cramped space allowed. There was no ceremony, no prayers, just silence and the grinding knowledge that she would not be the last. Day 6. The heat during the day became suffocating. The cold at night cut through their thin uniforms. Women slipped in and out of consciousness. Some hallucinated, calling out for water that did not exist, seeing doors that did not open. Trudy, the nurse, tried to keep people alive using nothing but words. "Stay awake," she whispered to those fading. "Breathe slowly. Conserve your strength." But strength was a resource that ran out. By day 9, 2 more had died. Ottilie Dressler, and a young woman whose name Hannelore never learned. 3 bodies now, propped against the walls because there was no room to lay them flat. Dorla Pfeiffer sat near the door, her hand resting on the wood. Sometimes she scratched at it weakly, her fingernails leaving faint marks. She did not know why. Maybe she hoped someone would hear. Maybe she just needed to feel like she was doing something other than waiting to die. On day 10, the train stopped moving entirely. The engine went silent. Even the distant sounds of war, artillery, aircraft, trucks, faded away. The boxcar sat in absolute stillness on a forgotten siding. Hannelore's final diary entry, written on day 11, said simply, "No water for 8 days. 3, dead. I cannot feel my legs." Trudy says to hold on. But hold on to what? We are already ghosts. Day 12 came, and then, finally, the sound of voyages outside. American voices. April 29th, 1945. A railway yard on the eastern edge of Frankfurt. The morning was cold, the sky the color of old steel. Sergeant Roscoe Henriksen led his squad through the abandoned rail yard, searching for anything useful the retreating Wehrmacht might have left behind. They had done this dozens of times in the past month. Crates of ammunition, abandoned vehicles with empty fuel tanks, warehouses full of uniforms that would never be worn again. Henriksen was a steel mill worker from Pittsburgh before the war. He was 32 years old, which made him ancient compared to most of his men. He had seen Normandy. He had fought through France, and 3 weeks earlier, he had walked through the gates of Dachau concentration camp. He thought he had seen the worst of what human beings could do to each other. He was wrong. Private Virgil Lundquist, a wheat farmer from Kansas, stopped first. He was 20 years old with a face still young enough to show every emotion. Right now, that emotion was confusion. "Sarge," he said quietly. "You hear that?" Henriksen raised his hand. The squad stopped. They listened. At first, nothing. Just wind moving through the empty rail yard. Then, faint as a whisper, a sound. Scratching. Weak tapping. The sound of someone trying to knock, but lacking the strength to make a fist. The smell hit them next. Henriksen's nose wrinkled. He had smelled death before. Every soldier had by then. But this was different. This was death mixed with something else. Something living. "It's coming from that boxcar," Lundquist said, pointing to a rusted freight car sitting alone on a forgotten siding. They approached carefully. The boxcar doors were sealed with iron bars and heavy chains. Wehrmacht standard procedure for transporting prisoners. "Get bolt cutters," Henriksen ordered. While they waited, the sounds from inside grew clearer. Not quite moaning, not quite crying. Something human, but barely. Corporal Chester Pulaski, a Polish-American from Milwaukee who understood fragments of German, pressed his ear to the door. "Someone's alive in there," he said. "I can hear breathing." When the cutters arrived, it took 3 men to break the rusted chains. The door resisted at first, swollen in its frame from moisture and neglect. Then it gave way with a shriek of metal. The smell poured out like a physical thing. Lundquist stumbled backward, his hand flying to his mouth. 2 other soldiers turned away, gagging. Henriksen, harder and more experienced, held his ground, but his face went pale. He had walked through Dachau. He had seen the ovens. He had seen the mass graves with thousands of bodies stacked like cordwood. He thought nothing could shock him anymore. But this was different, because these women were still alive. Sunlight poured into the boxcar, illuminating a scene from hell. Bodies everywhere. Dozens of them. But as Henriksen's eyes adjusted, he realized with horror that some of the bodies were moving. Hands lifted weakly toward the light. Eyes opened, though barely. Mouths moved, though no sound came out. Jesus Christ, someone whispered behind him. They're alive. Not all of them. In the corner, 3 bodies lay absolutely still, their skin waxy and gray. Dead for days, maybe longer. But the others, 60, 70, maybe more, were breathing. Barely breathing, but breathing. And every single one of them was a woman. They wore the remnants of Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, now filthy and torn. Some had lost their shoes. Their hair hung in matted tangles. Their faces were skeletal, cheekbones jutting sharp beneath skin stretched tight. One woman sat propped against the wall near the door. Her eyes were open, staring at the soldiers with an expression that held no hope, no fear, nothing at all. Just emptiness. It was Doral Pfeiffer. She had been in the boxcar for 12 days. Henriksen knelt beside her. "Can you speak?" he asked. "Do you understand English?" Her lip moved but no sound came. Her throat was too dry. Henriksen grabbed his canteen, unscrewed the cap, and tilted it toward her mouth. She flinched, pulling back as if expecting a blow. But when the water touched her lips, her eyes widened. She grabbed the canteen with both hands, shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She drank in tiny sips, each one followed by a gasp, as if her body had forgotten how to process liquid. "Get medics!" Henriksen shouted over his shoulder. "Get everyone! We need water! Blankets! Medical supplies! Everything!" Within minutes, the rail yard transformed into controlled chaos. Soldiers ran in every direction. Field hospital units were called in. Trucks arrived with supplies. Officers who had been coordinating occupation duties now found themselves organizing an emergency rescue operation. One by one, the women were lifted from the boxcar. Most could not walk. Many could not even stand. The medics worked with desperate efficiency, checking pulses, starting intravenous lines, wrapping skeletal bodies in army blankets. Some women cried when they were touched. Others stared in silent disbelief, unable to process what was happening. Hannelore Voss was among the first carried out. As they lifted her onto a stretcher, she grabbed Henriksen's wrist. Her grip was weak but insistent. She pulled him close, her cracked lips moving. "12 Tage," she whispered. 12 days. Pulaski translated quietly. "She says 12 days, Sarge." Henriksen looked back at the boxcar, at the hell they had been living in. 12 days locked in darkness. No food, no water, no hope. "You're safe now," he told her, knowing she probably could not understand his words, but hoping she might understand his tone. "You're safe." Her eyes closed. Not in death, but in exhaustion so profound it looked like death. By noon, all the survivors had been evacuated. The medics counted them as they loaded into ambulances. 86 women pulled from that boxcar alive. 3 bodies left behind to be buried later with whatever dignity could be managed. Henriksen stood beside the empty boxcar, staring into the darkness inside. He had liberated a concentration camp 3 weeks ago. He had seen industrialized murder. He had documented evidence of genocide. But somehow, this felt worse, because this was not a death camp designed for extermination. This was simple abandonment. These women had been locked inside and forgotten, left to die, not because someone hated them, but because no one remembered they existed. Private Lundquist stood beside him. "Who were they, Sarge?" "Enemies," Henriksen said quietly. 12 days ago, they were our enemies." He paused, then added, "Now they're just people we need to save." What happened next would challenge everything those 86 women had been taught about the Americans who had defeated them. The field hospital was a collection of canvas tents set up in a cleared warehouse district 2 miles from the rail yard. It smelled of antiseptic, canvas, and diesel fuel from the generators powering the medical equipment. Corinne Ashworth, a 33-year-old Army nurse from Charleston, stood at the entrance as the first ambulance arrived. She had treated soldiers with limbs blown off, men with their intestines spilling out, boys screaming for their mothers as they died. But when the stretcher came through the tent flap and she saw what lay on it, something cracked inside her chest. The woman on the stretcher could not have weighed more than 70 pounds. Her uniform hung off her like a costume on a skeleton. Her eyes were sunken so deep they looked like holes in her skull. Her hands were curled into claws, the fingers bent and rigid from days of scratching at wooden walls. It was Dorla Pfeiffer. "Set her here," Dr. Ashworth said, her voice steady despite the horror she felt. Gently, they placed the stretcher on an examination table. Dorley's eyes tracked the nurse's movements, but she did not speak. Dr. Ashworth wondered if she even could speak anymore. "Can you tell me your name?" Ashworth asked in English, knowing it was pointless, but needing to try. No response. Dr. Ashworth began the examination. Severe dehydration, malnutrition bordering on starvation, signs of dysentery, possible kidney failure. Doral's pulse was weak and irregular, her blood pressure barely registerable. Medically speaking, this woman was dying. "Start an IV," Dr. Ashworth ordered. "Saline solution. Slow drip. Her system cannot handle too much at once." As the needle went into Dorley's arm, the young woman flinched. Her eyes widened. She tried to pull away, but she lacked the strength. Dr. Ashworth gently held her arm still. "It's okay," she said softly. "This will help you, I promise." Dorley's eyes filled with tears. Not from pain, from confusion, from the incomprehensible reality of being helped by those she had been taught would show no mercy. Over the next 6 hours, all 86 women were processed through the field hospital. The medical staff worked without rest, starting IVs, administering glucose, checking vitals, wrapping wounds, recording symptoms on clipboards that would later become evidence of what the Reich's collapse had done to its own people. Every single patient was in critical condition. Lieutenant Fern Kavanaugh Key, a nurse from Philadelphia, moved from bed to bed with mechanical efficiency. She had learned not to feel too much, not to let emotion interfere with the work. But when she checked the pulse of a woman who looked barely 18, her hand trembled. The pulse was there, faint, irregular, but there. "This one needs glucose immediately," she called out. "Blood pressure is almost nothing." Corporal Laverne Bergstrom, a nurse from Wisconsin whose grandmother had spoken German, knelt beside another patient. The woman was crying, speaking in broken sentences that Bergstrom could barely understand. "Sie töten mich," the woman whispered. "They will kill me." "Nein," Bergstrom said in her rough German. "Nein, wir helfen. We help. You are safe." The woman stared at her as if she had spoken nonsense. Americans helping Germans? Impossible. This had to be a trick, a delay before the execution. But the IV went into her arm. The warm saline began flowing into her collapsed veins. And slowly, against everything she believed, her body began to respond. By midnight, the senior medical officer, a surgeon named Major Preston Satterfield, called the staff together. "I need honest assessments," he said. "How many do we expect to lose?" The answers came quietly. "At least 12, one doctor said. "Maybe 15, said another. "Their bodies have been pushed beyond the limit." Major Satterfield was silent for a moment. Then he shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "We did not pull them out of that hell just to watch them die here. I want more supplies, more doctors, more nurses. Triple the tent space if you have to. We are going to save every single one we can." Within 2 hours, the field hospital had tripled in size. Additional tents were erected. More generators arrived. Supply trucks unloaded crates of IV solution, glucose, antibiotics, blankets, and surgical equipment. The Americans did not accept the prognosis of death. They fought it. Hannelore Voss lay on a cot, an IV in each arm. She drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, she watched the American nurses moving through the tent. They checked her pulse. They adjusted her blankets. They spoke to her in gentle tones, even though she could not understand the words. One nurse, Lieutenant Kavanaugh, sat beside her bed and spooned small amounts of broth into her mouth. Just chicken stock with a bit of rice. Anything heavier would make her sick. "Slow sips." Kavanaugh, Thatcher said softly. "Just a little at a time." Hannelore swallowed. The warmth spread through her chest. It was the first food she had tasted in 12 days. She tried to speak. Her voice came out as a croak. "Warum?" Why? Kavanaugh did not understand German, but she understood the question. She had heard it in a dozen different languages from a dozen different patients. Why are you helping me? Why are you being kind? She reached out and gently squeezed Hannelor's hand. Because you're human, she said simply. That's all. Just human. Hannelor's eyes filled with tears. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. She understood the hand holding hers. She understood that the enemy she had feared was saving her life. Across the tent, Waltraud Ebner, the nurse who had kept so many alive during those 12 days, was finally receiving care herself. A medic named Milo Jankowski was checking her vital signs. "You are a nurse?" he asked in broken German, pointing to the medical insignia on her torn uniform. Trudy nodded weakly. "Then you understand," he said. "You are very sick, but we will make you well." Trudy stared at him. For 12 days, she had been the one keeping others alive with nothing but words and willpower. Now this American medic was promising to save her. She whispered in German, "I do not understand you people." Jankowski smiled, even though he did not understand her words. He adjusted her IV and checked her pulse one more time. "Rest now," he said. "You are safe." That night, for the first time in 12 days, all 86 women slept in beds. Real beds with mattresses and clean sheets and wool blankets. And for the first time in longer than they could remember, they slept without fear of dying before morning. The paradox was unbearable. Their enemies were keeping them alive with a dedication their own government had never shown. Recovery was not fast. Recovery was painful, slow, and filled with small battles against bodies that had nearly given up. 3 women died in the first week despite the medical care. Their organs had been damaged too deeply. The Americans buried them in a military cemetery with full honors, marking their graves with simple wooden crosses. This confused the surviving women deeply. Why would the enemy honor their dead? But the remaining 83 clung to life with a determination that surprised even the doctors. Day by day, their bodies began to respond. The intravenous fluids brought hydration back to shriveled cells. The carefully measured meals began to rebuild wasted muscle. Color, faint but real, returned to gray faces. By the second week, most could walk again, though shakily. By the third week, they had been transferred from the field hospital to a converted school building that served as a temporary, displaced persons camp. But before the transfer, there was one procedure that changed everything: the delousing station. The facility was a converted bathhouse, hastily cleaned and equipped with hot water and soap. Real soap, not the ersatz gray blocks they had used in Germany made from clay and chemicals. American soap, white and clean, smelling faintly of something floral. Dorlip Pfeiffer was conscious when they brought her to the bathhouse. She could walk now, though barely, supported by 2 nurses. When she saw the tiled room and the steam rising from the showers, she stopped. Her mind, clouded by exhaustion and trauma, struggled to process what she was seeing. Showers, hot water. She had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories about the death camps, about gas chambers disguised as showers. "Nein," she whispered in German, trying to pull back. "Nein, bitte, nein." "No, please, no." Lieutenant Kavanaugh, who had learned a few German words from Corporal Bergstrom, understood immediately. She knelt beside Dorle, looking her in the eyes. "It's just water," she said slowly in broken German. "Nur Wasser. You are safe. I promise you are safe." Dorle searched the nurse's face for deception, for cruelty, for any sign of the monsters her government had described. She saw only kindness. It made no sense. Nothing made sense anymore. Slowly, with trembling hands, she allowed them to guide her to the shower. The water was hot. Actually hot. She had not felt hot water in over a year. When it touched her skin, washing away the filth of 12 days in hell, she broke down completely, sobbing, not from pain, but from relief so overwhelming it felt like breaking. Lieutenant Kavanaugh stayed with her, though fully clothed, standing under the spray, holding this enemy woman as she cried. The same scene played out across the bathhouse. Nurses washed hair matted with filth. They cleaned wounds. They spoke softly in broken German, or gentle English, offering words they hoped would comfort even if not fully understood. When Dorle finally stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a clean white towel, she caught sight of herself in a fogged mirror. The face that looked back was unrecognizable. Thin, haunted, but clean. For the first time in 12 days, was clean. The displaced persons camp was simple but clean. The women were given civilian dresses to replace their filthy Wehrmacht uniforms. Blue, gray, brown. Nothing fancy, but whole and clean. And then came the food. 3 meals a day. Every single day. Breakfast was usually porridge or bread with butter and jam. Real butter. Real jam. Lunch was soup or stew with vegetables. Dinner was more substantial. Potatoes, canned vegetables, occasionally chicken or beef. For women who had survived on coffee and turnip soup for years, who had watched their families starve while the government promised victory was just around the corner. This abundance was incomprehensible. Hannelore Voss sat at a long table in the mess hall, staring at the plate in front of her. Bread with butter, a bowl of vegetable soup with actual pieces of carrot and potato, a cup of real coffee. She ate slowly, mechanically, and then wrote in her diary that evening, "They feed us 3 times a day. The Americans feed us better than our own government fed us in the last 2 years of the war. How can this be true? How can the enemy show more care than our own leaders?" The cognitive dissonance gnawed at all of them. Some dealt with it by withdrawing, speaking to no one, eating mechanically, going through the motions of life without truly living. Others became defiant. Irmgard Stengel, a secretary from Dresden, insisted loudly that this was all propaganda. "They are fattening us up for something worse," she said. "You will see. The cruelty will come." But most, like Hannelore and Dorl and Trudy, fell into a confused middle ground. They could not deny what was happening. The food was real. The beds were real. The medical care was real. The kindness was real. And if all of that was real, then what did it say about everything they had believed before? The Americans also gave them tasks. Light work at first, just to provide structure, helping in the kitchen, folding laundry, organizing supply rooms. Waltraud Ebner was assigned to help in the camp infirmary alongside American medical staff. She watched them treat German civilians with the same care they gave American soldiers. She watched them use their limited supplies to help people who, weeks before, had been shooting at them. One afternoon, Private Milo Jankowski, the medic who had treated her in the field hospital, accidentally cut his hand while opening a crate of medical supplies. Trudy immediately grabbed bandages and began treating the wound. Jankowski looked at her in surprise. "You don't have to do that," he said through Corporal Bergstrom's translation. "You are not required to help us." Trudy, whose English was slowly improving, looked at him with genuine confusion. "You are hurt," she said simply in broken English. "So I help?" Jankowski smiled. Fair enough. That small interaction stayed with Trudy. The casualness of it, the normalcy. In her world, in the world she had known, enemies did not treat each other's wounds. Enemies did not smile at each other. But here, in this strange camp run by the people she had been taught to fear, she was being forced to see enemies as people. And it was terrifying. One evening in late May, Hannelore sat alone in the library room, staring at the diary in her hands. She picked up her pencil and wrote, "I am ashamed. Not of what I did during the war. I was just a radio operator. I am ashamed because I am happy here. I do not want to leave this place where I am fed and safe and treated like a human being. What kind of German does that make me?" She closed the journal and stared at the wall. The questions grew heavier every day, and soon, those questions would be forced into the light in a way none of them could ignore. Mid-June, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 5 weeks. The women had been in the displaced persons camp for nearly a month. Their bodies had recovered. They looked almost normal again. Healthy, well-fed, clean. But the psychological wounds were deeper and more complicated than any physical injury. One morning, notices were posted throughout the camp. All residents were required to attend a screening in the main hall that evening. No exceptions. No one told them what they would be watching. Hannelore felt uneasy as she entered the hall that night. Rows of chairs had been set up facing a white sheet hung on the wall. A projector sat in the back of the room, its reels already loaded. The women filed in quietly. Some whispered to each other, speculating. Others sat in silence, their faces tense. Colonel Grover Whitmore stood at the front of the room. He was a tall man with gray hair and a face that had seen too much war. He waited until everyone was seated, then spoke in German through an interpreter. "What you're about to see is real footage," he said, "taken by American and British soldiers. I am showing you this not to punish you, but because you deserve to know the truth about the regime you served." The lights dimmed. The projector clicked to life. At first, the images were confusing. Grainy black and white footage. American soldiers. A gate. Barbed wire. Then the camera panned across the camp. Bodies. Mountains of bodies. Skeletal prisoners in striped uniforms staring at the camera with hollow eyes. Mass graves. Ovens. The unmistakable evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. The narrator's voice, calm and American, explained what they were seeing. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, the Nazi concentration camps, the death factories. The room erupted in gasps. Some women covered their mouths. Others turned away, unable to watch. A few ran from the room, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor. Dorla Pfeiffer sat frozen in her seat, her hands gripping the armrest so hard her knuckles turned white. She had heard rumors during the war. Everyone had heard whispers about special camps for Jews and political prisoners. But the rumors had been vague, easy to dismiss as enemy propaganda. Nobody wanted to believe their government was capable of such things. But this was not propaganda. This was footage. Real footage. Documented. Undeniable. The camera showed American soldiers carrying skeletal survivors out of barracks. It showed piles of shoes, mountains of eyeglasses, children's toys. Hannelore Voss felt her stomach turn. She wanted to look away, but she could not. The images burned into her eyes, into her mind. The footage continued. 10 minutes. 15. 20. Each minute more horrifying than the last. When the screening finally ended and the lights came back on, the room was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what they had just seen pressed down on them like a physical force. Then someone started crying, soft at first, then louder. Within rubble and starvation and judgment. "My family will ask me where I have been," Hannelore said quietly. "They will ask me what happened. And when I tell them that the Americans saved my life, that they fed me and cared for me and treated me with kindness, they will not believe me. Or worse, they will think I am a traitor." Doral was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Then we tell them anyway. Someone needs to tell the truth, even if they do not want to hear it." The night before departure, the Americans organized a farewell gathering. There was food, of course. There was always food. Coffee and cake donated by American supply chains. A small band played American swing music. Some of the women danced with American soldiers. Awkward and hesitant, but real. Dr. Corinne Ashworth stood at the edge of the room, watching. She had treated these women when they were half dead. She had watched them recover physically and psychologically. Now she was watching them prepare to leave, to step back into a world that would not understand what they had experienced. Hannelore approached her. "Doctor," she said in careful English, "I want to thank you for everything." Dr. Ashworth smiled. "You do not need to thank me. I was just doing my job." "No," Hannelore said firmly. "Was more than job. You give me back my life, and you give me back my humanity. I will never forget that." Dr. Ashworth felt tears prick her eyes. "What will you do when you go back to Germany?" Hannelore thought for a moment. "I will rebuild, like everyone else. I will find my family. I will help my country heal. But I will never forget what I learned here. That enemies can show mercy. That kindness is stronger than hate. That every human life has value." She paused, then added quietly, "And I will teach these things to my children, so that maybe one day there will be no more enemies, just people." The next morning, the buses arrived. 83 women climbed aboard, carrying their small bags and their heavy memories. They waved goodbye to the American soldiers who had saved them. Some cried. Some smiled. All of them carried something they had not brought with them 4 months earlier. Hope. As the buses pulled away from the camp, Doral Pfeiffer looked back through the rear window. The Americans were still standing there, waving. She raised her hand in return, then turned forward toward whatever future awaited her in the ruins of Germany. In her pocket was her diary, filled with months of observations and revelations. On the last page, she had written one final entry that morning. "Today, I leave captivity, but I am freer now than I ever was before, because now I know the truth, and the truth terrible and beautiful as it is, has set me free. The women returned to a Germany that barely existed anymore. Cities reduced to rubble, families scattered or dead, food scarce, hope even scarcer. But they carried something with them that could not be destroyed by bombs or hunger or despair. Hannelore Voss returned to Hamburg and found her family living in the basement of a bombed-out building. She worked as a translator for the British occupation forces, using the English she had learned in the camp. In 1949, she married an American journalist and moved to Boston, where she lived until her death in 2001. In her later years, she gave numerous interviews about her experience. She spoke at schools, at veterans organizations, at peace conferences. She always told the same story, about 12 days in hell and 4 months learning what humanity truly meant. The soap, she would say, is what I remember most. Not the starvation, not the fear, the soap, because it represented everything my government had failed to teach me. That even enemies deserve dignity. That kindness is not weakness. That mercy is the truest form of strength. Dorle Pfeiffer stayed in Munich. She became a school teacher, focusing on history and ethics. She never married, dedicating her moments the entire room filled with the sound of women weeping, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere fundamental. Colonel Whitmore stood at the front of the room again. He waited until the crying subsided slightly, then spoke. "I showed you this," he said through the interpreter, "not to make you feel guilty for crimes you did not commit. Most of you were secretaries, nurses, radio operators. You did not pull triggers. You did not open gas chamber doors." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But you were part of a machine that made these horrors possible. And now you must decide what you believe. You can reject what you have seen. You can call it lies, or you can accept the truth and carry it with you." He turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing," he said. "The reason we are treating you with kindness, the reason we give you food and medicine and shelter, is not because we have forgotten what Germany did. It is because we refuse to become what Germany became." His voice hardened slightly. "That is the difference between us." Then he left. The women sat in silence for a long time after that. Waltraud Ebner stared at her hands, her mind racing. She had worked in military hospitals. She had treated wounded soldiers. She had believed she was serving her country, doing her duty. But what country had she really served? What had her duty supported? Irmgard Stengel, who had insisted for weeks that American kindness was a trick, sat with her face in her hands. She had called the food propaganda. She had said the medical care was a delay before punishment. But if the Americans had wanted to punish them, they could have simply left them in that boxcar to die. They could have let them starve in the field hospital. They could have done to them what Germany had done to millions. But they had not. That night, the dormitories were quiet except for the sound of crying. Women lay in their beds, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what they had seen. Hannelore sat at a small desk, her diary open in front of her. She picked up her pencil and wrote, "I understand now. The soap, the food, the kindness. It was not a trick. It was a lesson. They are showing us what we should have been, what humanity looks like when it is not poisoned by hatred. I thought captivity would destroy me, but it is rebuilding me instead. And I do not know if I will ever forgive myself for needing the enemy to teach me how to be human." Dorle Pfeiffer lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the officer who had locked them in the boxcar. He had told them the Americans would execute them on sight. He had been wrong about everything. The Americans had not executed them. They had saved them. They had fed them. They had treated them with a dignity her own government had never shown. And now she understood why. Because the Americans believed something Germany had forgotten. They believed that every human life had value, even enemy lives, even the lives of women who had served the Reich. The transformation was not complete. It would take years, maybe lifetimes, for these women to fully process what they had learned. But on that night in mid-June 1945, 83 German women began to understand that the world they had believed in had been built on lies, and the people who had destroyed that world were teaching them what truth looked like. August 1945. The repatriation orders finally arrived. The war in Europe had been over for 3 months. Germany was divided into occupation zones. The long process of rebuilding had begun, and the displaced persons, including the 83 women from the boxcar, needed to go home. The news was met with mixed emotions. Some women were overjoyed, desperate to reunite with their families. Others were terrified of what they would find. And a few, like Hannelore Voss, felt something close to grief. "I do not want to leave," Hannelore confessed to Dorle one evening. They were packing their few possessions into small bags provided by the Red Cross. "Is that terrible? I do not want to go back to Germany." Dorle shook her head. "It is not terrible. It is honest. Here we are safe. We are fed. We are treated like people. Out there is life instead to education." She kept her diary from the camp until she died in 1987. In her will, she donated it to a museum with a note that read, "So that future generations will know that healing is possible, even after the worst humanity can do." Waltraud Ebner returned to Berlin and continued working as a nurse. She eventually became the head of nursing at a major hospital. She never spoke publicly about her experience in the boxcar, but her colleagues said she treated every patient, German, American, Russian, anyone, with the same unwavering compassion. When asked why, she would simply say, "Because I learned from the best." Of the 83 women who left that camp in August 1945, 68 survived to see the reunification of Germany in 1990. Many of them stayed in contact, writing letters, attending reunions, supporting each other through decades of rebuilding. They never forgot what happened in that boxcar. But more importantly, they never forgot what happened after. The moment when their enemies became their saviors. The moment when hatred was replaced by hope. The moment when everything they believed was shattered and rebuilt into something stronger. The soap became more than soap. The bread became more than bread. The kindness became more than kindness. They became proof that even in the darkest moments of human history, even when nations are locked in total war, even when propaganda has poisoned every mind, humanity can still break through. The women in that boxcar were starving. The Americans found them half dead. But what the Americans gave them was not just food or medical care or shelter. They gave them back their humanity. And that, more than any weapon or strategy or victory, is what won the war that truly mattered. 89 women entered that boxcar in April 1945, expecting death at American hands. 86 survived to see the doors open. 83 lived to return home. And every single one of them carried a truth their government had tried to hide. The enemy was not a monster. The enemy was human. And in being human, the enemy showed them what they themselves had forgotten how to be. This was not propaganda. This was reality. And it changed everything. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, its tanks, or its archways. It was its insistence that even enemies deserve mercy. That kindness can defeat hatred. That dignity is not something earned. It is something given. The women from the boxcar learned that lesson in 4 months of captivity, and they spent the rest of their lives teaching it to others. Some lessons can only be learned from those we are taught to hate.